Well, I'm Ralph Torrie, and I work with, I have my own firm that does environmental work and software development. And we do a lot of work with local governments around the world, especially with the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, and here in Toronto with the Toronto Atmospheric Fund. But what we were trying to do here this week was invite the 10 or 15 most advanced cities, the ones who are now able to demonstrate that they're achieving emission reductions, and bring them together to find out what issues they're facing, what they think has to be done now if we're going to take it to the next level, which is not the 15 and the 20% reduction that cities like Toronto, like Copenhagen and Berlin have now been able to achieve, but to 40 and 50 and 60% and beyond. So it was really about stretching the targets and seeing if we can't go even further than these advanced cities have been able to go so far.
So you're saying 50%, 60% and beyond. Do you have a sense that cities can actually accomplish that?
Well, I think that really to achieve the greenhouse gas emission reductions and the air quality improvements that we're going to need in the long term can't be done just by local governments, but it certainly can't be done without them either. And the early indications are that when they put their minds to it, you really can achieve much greater emission reductions than most national governments seem to think are possible. You know, we have cities now that are turning in documented reductions of over 20%. And the interesting thing is that they've done it and their economies are better places now, and their communities are better places to live, and their air quality has improved. And this is actually the secret that needs to be uncovered about tackling the greenhouse gas issue. It's not the economy of increasing, it's not the economy that comes from reducing emissions that we should be worried about. There's wonderful economic opportunities in doing the things you have to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The economy we should be worried about is the one that comes if you let the emissions continue to grow. And you get into this scenario of more and more extreme weather, more and more severe floods and droughts and storms, and eventual deterioration of entire ecosystems like we're already seeing in the northern parts of Canada. That's the future that brings with it an economy that you don't want to have. And we have to turn the message around from this ridiculous view that is still out there in the mass media and is being supported to a certain extent by the business community and national governments, that somehow dealing with the greenhouse problem is going to wreck the economy. That's nuts. Not dealing with the greenhouse problem is what's going to wreck the economy. And the communities and the national governments that realize that soonest and get the jump on everyone else and actually developing the methods and the techniques and the technologies for reducing emissions, they will be the economic winners in the next century. And that's really a large part of what our best practice exchange here has been about, is showing how you can actually you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a way that makes your economy grow and creates jobs and makes your community a better place to live in all sorts of ways.
Why is this happening in some places and not in others, I guess is what I'm saying? Why is it happening in Copenhagen and not elsewhere? What's the ingredient?
I've been thinking a lot about this question of why this takes off in some cities and not in others this week, as I've been listening to all of these advanced cities. And I'm not sure that I can see a single explanation. But there are some things that tend to be present. First of all, there will be leadership on the city council. And it doesn't have to be the whole council, but in every one of these cities where we've seen them move ahead of the pack and tackle these issues in advanced ways, there will be at least one council member or one mayor that understands that this is the future, that this is the way to make your city a better place and to make your local economy healthier, is by tackling the greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental problems in your city. You always see that. Leadership at the political level. On top of that, you usually also see leadership from inside City Hall. It doesn't really take too many people inside the city government itself who are determined to try and make a difference before big things can start to happen. And so why some cities seem to get these people and other cities don't, I can't answer that. But one thing I know is that in the cities that are taking the most advanced approaches, sometimes what has made that happen is a very, very small group of people that were determined. Sometimes just one individual who got it in their head that they were going to put their city out in front on this issue. And you should never underestimate the impact that a determined individual can have. Another thing that you see is that in many of the local governments and in many of the cities that are most advanced, the city government is quite active in the economy. For example, they may own the local electric utility, or they may own the local district heating plant. And this gives them leverage, which they're not afraid to use to try and achieve some of their environmental objectives. And so some of the more advanced cities are advanced because they have more tools at their disposal. They have more ways that they can influence the level of emissions. And so once they decide they're going to do it, they're able to get further faster by making use of this influence that they have through the fact that they own or control the district energy utility or the electric utility, the waste management system, all of these other ways. And many of the European cities have a higher level of involvement and ownership in the economy than tends to be the case in North America.
Now, this best practices exchange is, I mean, I think of it as kind of a beacon of hope in a very dark time when, I mean, Kyoto is all snarled up, doesn't seem to be going anywhere. You have the international community fighting amongst itself, barely able to reach very, very modest targets. And you have cities here who are really kind of doing an end run around Kyoto. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, we've noticed for a long time, and one of the reasons I've been working with local governments is that especially the ones that are turned on to these issues, it's a much more positive experience than trying to work with national governments. Because for one thing, what happens at the national government issue, and especially at the international level, is you get the energy department representing one point of view and the environment department representing another point of view and the health department representing another point of view, and they're all at loggerheads half the time, defending territory and arguing with each other. You don't find this to nearly the same extent at City Hall. At City Hall, yes, there's a health department and an engineering department and a planning department, but they work towards a common goal of creating a better community in a way that you don't see enough of at the national level. And so one reason that local governments are able to make progress is there's just a whole lot less bullshit at the City Hall level than there is at the national level. I don't know any better way or more polite way to put it. And so they just get up in the morning and get things done. And if it's good for the city, they find a way to do it. That's what you find in a good, healthy, functioning City Hall, is that in the end, the territorial differences get set aside in preference for making sure that if something's good for the city, you're going to find a way to do it. So that's a general observation from working with cities for the past 10 years, is that there's more of a tendency to integrate and work together between different factions than you tend to find at the national level. I think also, and related to that, is that at the local government level, it's a very practical approach to government at the local level. And it's very much a hands-on, let's just do it kind of attitude. Issues are not quite as abstracted as they get at the national level. And so they just roll up their sleeves and start doing things. And before you know it, the results are coming in, and we've been quantifying them, and they're quite significant. And there's a greater tendency, unfortunately, at the national and the international level to be working at the abstract level and analyzing reports and analysis that are far removed from the day-to-day reality of traffic in the streets or the energy use in buildings that cities are dealing with all the time. And so I think that just allows them to see opportunities that are completely invisible from the higher level. And the whole notion of acting locally, thinking globally but acting locally, really comes home on this issue. You know, we see examples of it all the time. So I think that these are some of the things that seem to allow local governments to make progress at the same time that national governments are sort of gnashing their teeth and saying nothing can be done.
It's interesting, I was talking with a fellow from Curitiba.
Oh, yes.
Saying that they don't have a lot of money in Curitiba, but they compensate for that by using their imagination and doing things with imagination. And it really struck me that it's not a question of money here. In fact, I mean, what you're saying is that most of these initiatives can actually save a city money. Is imagination the missing ingredient here, or is it political will for the change to happen?
Well, I mean, I would always agree with the statement that imagination is the critical ingredient in coming up with futures that are attractive and worth working for. It's too easy for us to think that the future is going to be like the past, you know. It's the way of thinking that we always fall back on, is that how could the future be any different from what we already have here? How could you imagine a future that isn't completely dependent on fossil fuels, for example, because that's what we've got now. And it is very hard to imagine futures that are different from the past, even though when you think about it, that's what they always end up being. I mean, the future has a bad habit, or a good habit, depending on how you look at it, of turning out different from the past. And what we need to do is start thinking about positive futures that are practical and possible, that will bring down the level of environmental damage that we're doing to the planet, so that we can have healthy communities that are sustainable, and so that we can pass on an environment and a community to our children and our grandchildren that, that we can really feel good about. And I think we've stopped believing that's possible. And one of the things that the experience here this week has really helped us remember is, of course it's possible. And if we take control of our futures and insist on them being sustainable, we will find ways to do it. And yes, from that, the resources and the money and the investments, all of that will flow. But imagination is definitely the number one requirement for moving towards sustainability. When you look at what the climate science has been telling us for 20 years now, it's emissions have got to come down by 50%. And it's really pretty simple. It's not that complicated. We put up twice as much of this stuff as nature is able to breathe back out again. And until you can cut emissions in half on a global basis, the concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere are going to keep rising. It's really simple. And so you have to cut emissions in half on a global basis. Hardly anybody's talking about it. What we did with the Suzuki Foundation here in Canada is that let's not assume that's impossible, which is the knee-jerk reaction. Let's actually sit down with a good mathematical model of the Canadian energy system and the Canadian greenhouse gas emissions infrastructure and see if we can't tune it to the point where emissions are half of what they were in 1990. And so we systematically went through the Canadian economy. We looked at housing, we looked at electrical appliances, we looked at vehicles, we looked at commercial office buildings and industrial production and waste management. In each case, we looked where are the techniques and where are the technologies for reducing emissions in each of these sectors. So we put in the electric hybrid cars, which already get 3 or 4 times the gas mileage of our current vehicles that are out on the street here today. And we put in the new commercial office buildings, which for no greater price than conventional building practice are cutting fuel and electricity use by 60 and 70%. And we put in the renewable technologies. We put solar panels on the roofs. We put windmills up. We did all of these things, and we found, yes, you can still have economic growth and population growth in this country that more or less track official projections and still bring greenhouse gas emissions down to half their 1990 levels. You can do it. Yes, it will take a mobilization of resources and investment and policies that's on another level from what we've done so far. But let's not assume that it can't be done, because that's just not true. In fact, it's not that difficult from a technical point of view. The technologies are there. Many of them, most of them, maybe all of them are economically preferable to business as usual, especially if you start attaching any economic price tag to the damage we're doing with our conventional energy consumption system. As soon as you do that, then there's no question at all that the 50% reduction is the economically preferable way to go. So we think that we've pretty well demonstrated, yes, it's possible, yes, it's the economically preferable future. And what we're looking at now is how do we mobilize for this? And there's a lot of encouraging news on that. Because one of the things about the 50% target, there's a few things about it. First of all, we got to do this because we have to do this. That's the first thing. Maybe, most people don't need any further motivation. We've got to bring emissions down by 50%. And we have to do it. It's necessary. And therefore, we have to figure out how to do it. It's not a question of, well, what can we do that's economic? It's a question of how do we make it economic to achieve what we have to do. And beyond that, what we're noticing is that when you seriously look at the 50% scenario, it's an empowering thing to do. People get excited about doing things that will actually make a difference in a way they don't get excited about the incremental target. I mean, the Kyoto Protocol is a 6% reduction. What's the point? It buys us 15 years before we go sailing through the danger threshold in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. So if you're going to tackle the issue, tackle it seriously. If you're speeding towards a brick wall, what's the point in slowing down by 10 miles an hour? Which is what the Kyoto Protocol amounted to. And a lot of the bickering that goes on in the international community over how little it's possible to do and still meet Kyoto becomes irrelevant when you start talking about the 50% target, because you got to do all those things. So this stupid argument over whether you should plant trees or save energy completely melts away when you get serious about the problem, because you realize we've got to plant trees and we've got to save energy.
So you sound like, I mean, you sound almost hopeful, but at the same time frustrated. I mean, you're hopeful in the sense that these things can happen, but frustrated at the slow pace of things, of change.
Well, yeah, you do tend to worry sometimes when you look at how fast climate change may be coming at us, whether or not we are going to be able to change quickly enough. I think that the motivation for changing is going to come, because I think that the climate change itself is going to accelerate to the point where the level of support for this change is going to increase very quickly and very dramatically. And one of the things about working with these cities is that they really are the ones that are that are making up the blueprints and showing us the way, so that when we're ready to get serious, and when our national government is ready to get serious, at least there'll be some of us who have got an idea about what that means, you know. When they're ready to go for 60% instead of 6%, at least there'll be some cities that have actually demonstrated how you can get emissions going down in the community. And so that's a big part of what we're doing here, and you get some hope from that. But I have to tell you that the science is moving very quickly. And you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has tried to use the mechanism of consensus for coming up with recommendations about how serious the problem is. Well, consensus is a wonderful thing, but it's not the way that scientific truth is revealed. And if it happens to be the case that we not only have a problem, but that the problem is much more serious and is accelerating much more quickly than the scientific consensus has been able to agree upon, then we could be looking at climate change rates that are much quicker than what we've even been thinking about preparing for. And you have to worry about that, because these futures are ones that could get out of control on us. And at a certain point, natural feedback loops will come into play that will make it impossible for us to stop the climate change situation from deteriorating, until some kind of collapse takes place. We still have a chance, maybe for another 10 years, maybe for another 20 or 30 years, we still have an opportunity during that window where the human term, the carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel use and the deforestation activities of human activities are still large enough compared to all the other natural cycles that if we can bring those terms under control, we can stop this thing from accelerating any further. But at some point, our own emissions will trigger positive feedback loops in nature that have to do with the methane that's stored in the permafrost and all kinds of other phenomenon that will make it no longer possible to stop climate change from accelerating essentially out of control. That's the worst case scenario, and it's one that we used to think was not very likely and was way off in the future. And what worries me recently is that more and more scientists are saying that future is more possible than we had hoped, and it may be closer in the future than we had thought. So we've got to, I guess the implication of that is that we really have to, it's really a great test of mankind's ability to use the brain we were given to respond to a crisis which David Suzuki sometimes calls a slow motion crisis. It's coming at us very, very slowly, but if we wait until it's obviously serious enough and killing enough people and causing enough damage that we're ready to take serious action, at that point it may be too late to bring it under control. So we have to have the intelligence and the foresight and the discipline to tackle this issue before it gets out of control, instead of waiting until after it's too late, in which case all we will be able to do is cope with the consequences and try and ride out what will be a very, very difficult and dark period in human history. And we want to avoid that route. There's a much more positive way that we can go by tackling the issue now. And the great thing is that as far as we can tell, if you bite the bullet on this issue, you end up with a better economy and better communities, and you achieve a lot of other environmental objectives at the same time.
cops are watching us.